Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Is that a knockoff? Beatrice Vance sneered, fingering Elena's collar in front of the gala guests. The question hung in the air, sharper than the scent of the cloying lilies decorating the ballroom. Elena Vance didn't flinch, though she felt the eyes of the city's elite burning into her back. The silk of her gown was understated, a deep charcoal that didn't scream for attention, unlike the shimmering gold sequins her mother wore like armor. Beatrice didn't wait for an answer. She turned to Clara Vance and the other women circling them, her laughter like breaking glass. I suppose we can't all have the family's eye for quality. Poor Elena always did prefer the bargain bin to the boutique. A ripple of polite, cruel amusement traveled through the group. Elena remained still, her pulse a steady, rhythmic thrum in her ears. She watched her mother's hand, manicured to a lethal point, drop from her shoulder with a dismissive flick. "Mother, please," Elena said, her voice low and level. "The fabric is Italian. It doesn't need to sparkle to be real." "It's the person inside it that lacks the sparkle, dear," Beatrice replied, already looking past her daughter for someone more important. Julian Vance stepped into the circle then, a flute of vintage champagne in one hand and a smirk on his face that Elena recognized all too well. He adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo, making sure the light caught his new Patek Philippe watch. Elena's eyes narrowed. That watch cost more than the quarterly dividends Julian had claimed were lost to market fluctuations in the family trust. "Don't be so hard on her, Mom," Julian said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Elena's busy playing architect in that drafty little studio of hers. She doesn't have time for the finer things. Someone has to actually work for a living while I handle the heavy lifting of the Vance estate." "Heavy lifting?" Elena asked. "Is that what you call spending the afternoon at the club?" Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before his entitlement surged back. He leaned in, the smell of expensive scotch and arrogance radiating off him. "I call it networking, something you wouldn't understand. By the way, I saw the bills for your firm's latest project. You're over budget again. I might have to talk to the trustees about cutting back your allowance." The injustice of it was a cold weight in Elena's chest. He was stealing from the foundation, bleeding the family legacy dry to fund his gambling and his ego, all while Beatrice smiled and looked the other way. "I don't have an allowance, Julian," she reminded him. "I have a salary, which is more than I can save for you." Beatrice's head snapped back toward them. "That's enough, Elena. Don't be jealous of your brother's position. He has a natural head for the estate. You were always too emotional for the numbers." Elena looked at the witnesses. Clara Vance was watching with a predatory curiosity, her champagne glass paused at her lips. Two board members stood nearby, their expressions unreadable but their attention fixed. The humiliation was the point. Beatrice wasn't just insulting her. She was devaluing Elena's stock in the family in front of the people who mattered most. "I see," Elena said softly. She turned away, the sound of her heels clicking against the checkered marble like a countdown. She needed air. She pushed through the heavy French doors leading to the terrace, the cool night whined a mercy against her skin. "They haven't changed, have they?" Elena turned to find Uncle Arthur standing by the stone balustrade, a shadow in the moonlight. He was the only one who had ever looked at her with anything resembling pride. "They're worse," Elena admitted, her fingers gripping the cold stone. "Julian is wearing a $60,000 watch while he tells me the firm's accounts are dry." Arthur moved closer, the scent of old paper and peppermint following him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, unassuming USB drive. He didn't hand it to her yet. "Beatrice thinks she's playing a game of chess, but she's forgotten that the board has two sides," Arthur whispered. "Julian isn't just spending the money, Elena. He's moving it. I found the ledger entries Simon Thorne was asking about." Elena felt a spark of something fierce and predatory wake up inside her. For years, she had played the dutiful daughter, the quiet architect, the one who took the insults and the dismissals because she believed in the sanctity of the Vance name. But the Vance name was being gutted by the very people who claimed to protect it. "Is it all there?" she asked. "Everything. The offshore transfers, the forged signatures, the shell companies Julian set up in your name to take the fall if the audit ever went south. Elena's breath hitched. Julian hadn't just been stealing, he had been framing her for the theft. The betrayal was absolute. It was a blood debt. "Give it to me," she said. Arthur handed her the drive. "What are you going to do, Elena?" She felt the weight of the plastic in her palm, a small thing with the power to level the house Beatrice had built on lies. She thought of the gala inside, the laughter, the way her mother had sneered at her dress, and the way Julian had bragged about his stolen wealth. "I'm going to do what Mother always wanted," Elena said, her voice as cold as the marble beneath her hands. "I'm going to show her exactly what a Vance is capable of." She pulled her phone from her clutch and typed a quick message to Simon Thorne. "I have the keys. Prepare the filing." Elena looked back through the glass doors. Beatrice was center stage, holding court, blissfully unaware that the foundation of her world had just developed a terminal crack. The silent recovery had begun. Elena tucked the drive into her bodice, feeling its hard edge against her heart. She didn't need sequins to shine. She just needed the truth. She walked back into the ballroom, her head held high. When Julian caught her eye and winked, thinking he had won the round, Elena didn't look away. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that should have made him run for the exits. 2 days until the board meeting. 2 days until the audit. 2 days until the world realized that the poor, emotional Elena Vance was the only one left in the room with the power to burn it all down. The next morning, the breakfast room at the Vance estate was bathed in a deceptive, golden light that made the heavy mahogany furniture glow. Beatrice Vance sat at the head of the table, the silver spoon in her hand, clinking rhythmically against a bowl of bone china. It was a sound Elena had once found comforting. Now, it sounded like a countdown. The air smelled of over-roasted Kona coffee and the cloying, floral scent of her mother's perfume, a fragrance that always seemed to precede a demand. Julian entered 10 minutes late, his eyes bloodshot and his movements sluggish. He smelled of last night's scotch and the lingering smoke of the gala's cigar lounge. He didn't look at Elena as he pulled out a chair. He never did unless he was about to take something from her. "You look tired, Elena," Beatrice said, her voice smooth as silk but laced with a familiar poison. She didn't look up from her grapefruit. "Perhaps if you spent less time at that little boutique firm of yours and more time focusing on the family's needs, you wouldn't look so weathered." Elena didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the bitterness coating her tongue. "The firm is doing well, Mother. We just landed the Miller account." Julian snorted, reaching for a piece of dry toast. "The Miller account? That's adorable. I'm handling the downtown redevelopment project. Real architecture, not just choosing curtains for suburban housewives." Elena felt the vibration of her phone against her thigh, a message from Simon Thorne. She didn't need to look at it to know the audit was already in motion. "I'm sure the board will be very interested in your progress on that project at the meeting tomorrow," she said quietly. Beatrice set her spoon down with a sharp asterisk clack that echoed through the silent room. "Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss. Julian has had a small, administrative hiccup, a shortfall in the project's liquid assets. It's nothing serious, just a matter of timing." She finally looked at her daughter, her eyes cold and calculating. "I need you to sign over your quarterly dividends from the legacy fund. We'll use them to bridge the gap before the auditors arrive tomorrow morning." The audacity of the request felt like a physical blow. They weren't just asking for help. They were demanding she sacrifice her only financial safety net to hide Julian's theft. Elena looked at her brother. He was smirking, his entitlement so thick it was suffocating. "You want my inheritance to cover his hiccup?" Elena asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Family protects family, Elena," Beatrice snapped, her facade of grace beginning to crack. "Don't be selfish. You have a salary." Julian has a reputation to maintain. If the board sees a deficit, it reflects on all of us. Uncle Arthur is already asking questions he shouldn't be asking. We need to close this hole today. Julian leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Besides, I did you a favor. I showed the lead developer your blueprints for the atrium last night. I told them I designed them. They loved it. You should be thanked that your work is finally being used for something prestigious. Elena's nails dug into her palms under the table. He hadn't just stolen the money, he had stolen her intellectual property to bolster his failing career. The rage was a hot, bright flame in her chest, but she dampened it. She needed them to believe she was still the compliant daughter. "The board meeting is at 10 tomorrow," Elena asked, ignoring the insult. "Yes," Beatrice said, her posture relaxing as she assumed she had won. "Simon Thorne will be there to finalize the quarterly reports. I expect you to have the transfer papers signed by tonight. Clara will bring them to your room." Elena stood up, her chair scraping softly against the marble floor. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket, a cold, hard promise of what was to come. They thought they were inviting her to a routine meeting to witness their continued dominance. They had no idea they were inviting the executioner to the feast. "I'll be there," Elena said, her gaze lingering on Julian's smug face. "I wouldn't miss it for the world. I think it's time everyone saw exactly what has been happening with the Vance legacy." As she walked out of the room, she pulled her phone from her pocket. Simon's message was brief. "The forensic team is standing by. The trap is set." Elena stepped into the foyer, the morning sun hitting her face. She had 24 hours. 24 hours until the small shortfall became a gaping abyss that would swallow Beatrice and Julian whole. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like a storm. 2 days later, the sterile silence of Simon's inner sanctum felt like the inside of a vault. Elena sat in a leather chair that smelled of aged mahogany and expensive tobacco, watching the blue light of a computer monitor reflect in the glass of her water. The city hummed 30 floors below, a distant, frantic world that seemed entirely irrelevant to the digital carnage unfolding on the screen. Simon Thorne tapped a key, his expression as sharp as the crease in his charcoal suit. "It's more than a shortfall, Elena. It's a systematic gutting." He pointed to a series of shell companies, Vance Global Logistics, Vance Heritage Holdings, all bleeding into a private account in the Cayman Islands. "Julian hasn't just been incompetent, he's been a vacuum. And Beatrice, she signed off on every single transfer under the guise of operational expenses." Elena felt a strange, cold calm. She touched the smooth surface of the desk, her fingers tracing a deep grain in the wood. "How much?" "4.8 million in the last 18 months alone," Simon replied, leaning back. "The legacy isn't just leaning, it's about to collapse. If the board sees this at the Centennial Gala tonight, there won't just be a firing. There will be handcuffs." The secret power of the information felt like a physical weight in Elena's pocket. She wasn't the girl who had been pushed out of her own father's study anymore. She was the one holding the detonator. Her phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID flashed, Mother Asterisk. Elena answered, her voice a flat line. "Yes." "Elena, darling, do try to sound less like a funeral director." Beatrice's voice crackled with the artificial brightness of a woman who had just spent a small fortune. In the background, she could hear the rhythmic asterisk clink-clink asterisk of hangers on a metal rack and the hushed, sycophantic tones of a high-end boutique clerk. "I met Lawrence with Clara Vance. We're picking out her gown for tonight, since you've decided to be so. Difficult lately, I've decided Julian will be the one to deliver the keynote speech. It's only fitting for the future head of the house. I'm sure Julian will give them exactly what they deserve," Elena said, her eyes meeting Simon's. "Don't be snide. It doesn't suit your station," Beatrice snapped, her tone shifting to a razor-edged dismissiveness. "And for heaven's sake, wear that gray dress. It's drab enough to keep you in the background where you belong. We wouldn't want you embarrassing the family in front of the governor, would we? You're lucky I'm even letting you through the door after the scene you made at breakfast." A sharp, entitled laugh erupted in the background. "Julian. Tell her to bring my dry cleaning if she's coming. The Ferrari needs a detail too, but I suppose she's too busy architecting her little fantasies to do a real job." Elena's grip tightened on the phone until her knuckles turned white. The rage spike was familiar, a hot flash of indignation that she'd spent years suppressing. But today it didn't burn, it fueled. "I'll see you at the gala, Beatrice. I wouldn't miss Julian's big moment for the world." She hung up before her mother could get the last word. "They're at Laurent S., she told Simon, her voice dropping an octave. "Spending money they've already stolen." "Let them," Simon said, sliding a thick, cream-colored envelope across the desk. "This contains the certified forensic audit. Uncle Arthur has already secured the original ledgers from the vault. He's meeting us at the ballroom entrance at 7. Elena stood, the silk of her blouse rustling in the quiet room. She looked at the envelope, then at the city skyline. The countdown was no longer measured in hours, but in heartbeats. "Is everything ready on the technical side?" she asked. Simon nodded. "The tribute video Julian thinks he's introducing. I've replaced the file on the gala's server. When he hits play to show the Vance family's charitable contributions, the room is going to see a very different kind of math." Elena walked toward the door, her heels clicking with a rhythmic finality against the marble floor. She thought of the gray dress Beatrice Vance had ordered her to wear. She wouldn't be wearing it. She had a vintage Dior in the back of her car, midnight black, the color of a storm at sea. As she stepped into the elevator, the sensory anchor of the day hit her, the scent of Simon's expensive espresso mixing with the ozone of the approaching rain outside. It smelled like the end of an era. She pulled her coat tighter around her, the flash drive a cold promise against her thigh. 2 hours. In 2 hours, the lights would go up, the champagne would be poured, and the Vances would stand on their pedestal for the very last time. Elena watched the floor numbers descend, a slow smile finally touching her lips. The sleeping lion wasn't just awake, she was hungry. She stepped out into the lobby, the humid air of the afternoon pressing against her. She saw Julian's new Ferrari parked illegally in the red zone across the street, its cherry red paint a garish scream of unearned luxury. He was likely inside the jeweler's next door, probably buying a watch to match the car he couldn't afford. Elena Vance didn't look away. She didn't feel the old sting of exclusion. She simply adjusted her own watch, noted the time, and walked toward her modest sedan. "Wait for it," she whispered to the empty street. The trap wasn't just set. The prey was already walking into the cage, laughing all the way to the stage. The day before the gala, the Vance estate smelled of forced elegance and expensive lilies. Elena Vance parked her modest sedan at the far end of the gravel driveway, well away from the gleaming Ferrari that Julian had positioned like a trophy in the center of the turnabout. She stepped out, the humid afternoon air carrying the rhythmic asterisk clink 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 asterisk of crystal glasses being polished by a small army of caterers. She found Julian standing on the terrace, a flute of vintage champagne already in his hand at 10 in the morning. He looked every bit the heir apparent in his tailored Italian suit, though the way he barked orders at the floral designers suggested a man trying too hard to fill shoes that didn't fit. "You're late, Elena," Julian said without turning around. He took a slow sip, his posture radiating a smug, unearned victory. "Then again, I suppose punctuality isn't a priority when you're just a guest at your own family's triumph." Elena didn't flinch. She walked to the edge of the stone balustrade, looking down at the massive white marquee being erected on the manicured lawn. "It's quite a display, Julian. I hope the foundations are as solid as the decorations." He finally turned, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "The foundations are gold, sister, pure Vance-engineered gold. While you were busy playing architect with your little charity projects, I was securing our future. You should be thanking me. Tomorrow night, the Vance name becomes untouchable." Elena adjusted the strap of her bag, her fingers brushing against the cold, hard edge of the encrypted flash drive nestled inside. It felt like a live wire against her hip. Untouchable is a dangerous word. Usually, it just means no one has found the right place to pull the thread yet. Julian let out a sharp, barking laugh that made a nearby server jump. "The only thread you'll be pulling is the one on that thrift store dress you're planning to wear. Do yourself a favor, Elena. Stay in the shadows tomorrow. I wouldn't want your modest aesthetic to ruin the photos for the board members. They expect excellence, not charity cases." He brushed past her, the heavy scent of his expensive cologne, a cloying mix of sandalwood and arrogance, lingering in the air. He didn't notice the way Elena's gaze followed him, cool and clinical. He didn't see Uncle Arthur standing in the shadows of the library's French doors, watching the exchange with a grim, knowing expression. Arthur stepped out once Julian was out of earshot. The older man looked tired, the weight of decades of family secrets etched into the lines around his eyes. He handed Elena a small, cream-colored envelope. Simon Thorne called. The final injunction is drafted and the ownership transfers are verified. It's all there, Elena. Every diverted fund, every forged signature Julian used to build this gold foundation. Once this is opened, there's no going back. The Vances, as you know them, will cease to exist. Elena took the envelope. The paper was thick, high-quality vellum that felt strangely heavy in her hand. They ceased to exist the moment they decided my life was collateral for their greed, uncle. Tomorrow isn't a funeral, it's an eviction. Clara is worried, Arthur whispered, glancing toward the upper windows where Julian's wife, Elena Vance, was likely obsessing over seating charts. She thinks you're planning to make a scene. A scene is for amateurs, Elena replied, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. I'm planning a reckoning. She left him there, walking back to her car with a steady, measured pace. She had one more stop to make. Simon Thorne was waiting at his office with the final set of keys, not to a house, but to the entire Vance empire. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the estate was bathed in the artificial glow of 1,000 fairy lights, Elena sat in her darkened living room. The gala invitation sat on her coffee table, the gold-embossed letters mocking her, a night of legacy. She picked up her phone and sent a single text to Simon. Everything is in place. See you at the opening toast. She leaned back, closing her eyes. The countdown had reached its final hours. Tomorrow, Julian would stand before the world and claim a throne built on sand. And Elena would be the one to let the tide in. The evening of the Vance Gala arrived with a suffocating elegance that seemed to coat the very air in gold leaf. Elena stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her fingers grazing the cool, velvet-lined clutch that held her secret. The estate was a labyrinth of light. Thousands of fairy lights dripped from the ancient oaks outside, while inside, the scent of white lilies and expensive champagne was almost dizzying. She watched the elite of the city drift across the marble floor, their laughter tinkling like the fine crystal they held. To them, this was a celebration of a dynasty. To her, it was the final viewing of a crime scene. She smoothed the front of her gown, a structured emerald silk that shimmered with a dangerous, dark luster. She had spent a decade playing the shadow, the quiet architect who shored up the foundations while Julian and Beatrice preened in the sun. Tonight, the shadows were coming to life. "You're actually here," a sharp, familiar voice cut through the music. Elena turned to see Beatrice Vance gliding toward her. Her mother was a vision of icy silver, her neck draped in diamonds that had been bought with the dividends of Elena's hard labor. Beatrice didn't offer a hug or a smile. Instead, her eyes raked over Elena's dress with a clinical, disparaging tightness. "I suppose someone had to represent the working side of the family," Beatrice said, her voice dropping so the nearby senator's wife wouldn't hear. "Though that color is a bit aggressive, don't you think? It screams for attention, Elena, a trait you've thankfully lacked until now." "I thought it was time I stopped blending into the wallpaper, Mother," Elena replied, her voice as steady as the heartbeat she could feel thrumming in her fingertips. Beatrice gave a dismissive sniff, adjusting a diamond cuff. "Just try not to hover. Julian is about to make the announcement of the century, and I won't have you dampening the mood with your talk of sustainability or budgetary oversight. This night is about legacy, not ledger sheets." She moved away before Elena could respond, her silk train hissing against the floor like a serpent in the grass. Elena didn't let the sting linger. She had lived with the venom for 28 years. She was finally immune. She scanned the room and found Julian Vance standing near the grand staircase, surrounded by a circle of sycophants. He looked every bit the crown prince, his tuxedo tailored to perfection, a glass of vintage cognac in one hand. He was laughing, his head thrown back with the practiced ease of a man who had never known a day of genuine consequence. As Elena approached, Julian caught her eye and gestured for her to join the circle. The men around him, investors and old money ghosts, parted to let her in, though their eyes remained fixed on Julian. "Ah, the big sister arrives," Julian announced, his voice booming with performative affection. He looped an arm over her shoulder, the weight of it heavy and possessive. "I was just telling the board members about the new Vance Heights development. It's going to be the jewel of the coast. Of course, Elena did what do you call it? The technical drawings, the boring stuff." A few of the men chuckled. Julian squeezed her shoulder, his thumb digging into the silk of her dress. "Don't look so sour, Elle," he whispered, leaning close enough that she could smell the expensive tobacco on his breath. "I'll make sure you get a nice little bonus once I sign the final merger tonight. Maybe you can finally afford a house that isn't a glorified shoebox. Just keep your mouth shut during the toast. I don't want any of your structural integrity concerns spooking the Thorne Group." "I wouldn't dream of spooking them, Julian," Elena said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I want them to see everything exactly as it is." Julian smirked, misinterpreting her words as submission. He patted her cheek, a gesture so condescending it made the blood in her veins turn to ice, and turned back to his audience. He was so blinded by the glare of his own reflected glory that he couldn't see the cliff he was walking toward. Elena stepped back, her gaze drifting toward the far corner of the room. Simon Thorne stood there, leaning against a fluted pillar. He was the only person in the room not holding a glass. When he saw her, he gave a single, imperceptible nod. The documents were filed. The digital trail was live. The trap was set, and the bait was Julian's own insatiable greed. She felt a hand on her elbow and turned to find Uncle Arthur. His face was a mask of practiced neutrality, but his eyes were sharp. "The board is gathered in the library for the pre-toast briefing," Arthur murmured. "Julian thinks it's a formality to confirm his chairmanship. He's already told the caterers to start the 1945 vintage the moment he steps onto the podium." "Let him have his vintage," Elena said quietly. "It's the last thing he'll ever taste on the family's tab." "Are you ready, Elena?" Arthur asked. "Once the first domino falls, there is no stopping the rest. Beatrice will never forgive you for the public embarrassment." Elena looked at her mother, who was currently laughing at a joke made by a man whose company Julian had nearly bankrupted 6 months ago. She looked at Julian, who was preening for a photographer. "Mother's forgiveness was never on the table, Arthur," Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. "And Julian's legacy is a house built on stolen bricks. I'm not just stopping the dominoes. I'm burning the table." The lights in the ballroom flickered twice, the signal for the guests to gather toward the grand staircase for the opening address. The quartet shifted from a light Vivaldi to a more ceremonial march. The air in the room seemed to tighten, the collective anticipation of the crowd rising like a physical heat. Julian began to make his way toward the stairs, his chest puffed out, his hand already reaching for the microphone. He looked back at Elena, a mocking wink flashing across his face. He thought he was ascending his throne. Elena didn't follow him. Instead, she turned her back on the stairs and walked toward the library, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic countdown against the marble. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small, silver flash drive. Behind her, she heard Julian's voice amplify through the speakers, booming with the unearned confidence of a king. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian's voice echoed, "welcome to the beginning of a new era for the Vance family." Elena pushed open the heavy oak doors of the library. The board members looked up, surprised by her intrusion. She didn't say a word. She simply walked to the central table, where the master laptop was connected to the ballroom's massive projection screens. "Actually," Elena whispered to the empty room as she slotted the drive into the port, "it's the end of one." Elena stood in the shadows of the library for a heartbeat, her thumb still resting on the laptop's trackpad. Outside the heavy oak doors, the muffled, rhythmic clapping for her brother felt like a countdown. She could smell the old, vanilla-scented dust of the bookshelves mixing with the sharp, metallic tang of the cooling fan in the master laptop. With a single, decisive tap, she executed the file. The screen flickered, the progress bar jumping to 100%, and a soft chime echoed in the quiet room. It was done. She didn't stay to watch the monitor. She turned and gripped the cold brass handle of the library doors, pushing them open. The hallway was a tunnel of silence that led back to the roar of the ballroom. As she walked, the high-pitched click of her heels against the marble floor sounded like the ticking of a clock. She reached the double doors of the grand hall and paused. The cheering had stopped. It hadn't just faded. It had been severed, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Elena pushed the doors open. The ballroom was bathed in the flickering blue light of the massive projection screens. The scent of expensive lilies and aged scotch was thick, but the atmosphere had turned stagnant. Every head was tilted back, eyes locked on the glowing evidence behind the podium. In place of the Vance family crest, the screens now displayed a series of internal ledgers. The numbers were stark, highlighted in red, showing the systematic siphoning of the Vance Charitable Trust into a private account under a shell company. Julian stood at the center of the stage, the microphone still clutched in his hand. The color didn't just leave his face. It seemed to evaporate, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray that made the sweat on his forehead shine like oil under the stage lights. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, his bottom lip trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch that mirrored the frantic, panicked blinking of his left eye. He looked less like a king and more like a cornered animal, realizing the cage had no floor. His chest hitched in shallow, jagged bursts as he stared at the screen, his fingers white-knuckled against the wood of the podium until it groaned. He looked utterly hollowed out, the bravado stripped away to reveal a terrified boy who had finally run out of lies. This is some kind of joke," Julian finally stammered, his voice cracking and echoing through the speakers. He looked down at the front row, his eyes searching for an ally. "Elena, what is this? What have you put up there?" Elena didn't stop walking until she reached the foot of the stage. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room shifting toward her. To her left, Beatrice Vance stood as if turned to stone, her crystal flute slipping from her gloved hand. It shattered against the marble with a sound like a gunshot, champagne splashing across her designer hem, but she didn't even blink. Nearby, Simon Thorne was already moving, unzipping a leather briefcase with a metallic rasp that cut through the hush. Uncle Arthur stood by the far pillar, a slow, grim smile spreading across his weathered face as he gave Elena a single, sharp nod of validation. Even Clara Vance had retreated into the shadows of the velvet curtains, her head bowed in a shame that felt as heavy as the silence. "It's not a joke, Julian," Elena said, her voice calm and steady, carrying easily without the need for a microphone. "It's a forensic audit. Those are your signatures on the wire transfers. Those are the dates you claimed you were overseeing the foundation's expansion." Julian lunged toward the edge of the stage, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You're trying to ruin me. You've always been jealous of what I have." Elena looked up at him, her expression unmoved. The rage that had fueled her for weeks had cooled into something sharper, something crystalline. "I'm not ruining you. I'm just showing everyone who you really are. You told me earlier tonight that I was a guest in this house, that I didn't belong at this table." She paused, letting the words hang in the air as the board members began to murmur, their faces hardening as they processed the theft. "But the deed currently being projected on that screen proves that the Vance estate was never yours to manage." "I am the majority shareholder, Julian. You aren't the heir. You're just the tenant, and your lease just expired." She didn't wait for his reply. She didn't need to hear his excuses or watch the security team, led by a grim-faced Simon, begin their ascent to the stage. She turned her back on the flickering blue light and the brother she no longer recognized, walking out of the ballroom as the first wave of shouting began behind her. For the first time in years, the air outside the doors tasted clean. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung shut behind her, but they couldn't quite drown out the sound of a world ending. Elena Vance stood in the center of the marble foyer, the silence of the vaulted space pressing against her ears like a physical weight. The air here was cooler, smelling of rain, and the expensive floor wax used to maintain the illusions of the Vance estate. Behind those doors, the murmurs had turned into a roar, a chaotic symphony of shock and accusation. But out here, she finally had room to breathe. The doors burst open again less than a minute later. Julian Vance didn't walk. He stumbled out, his expensive Italian loafers skidding on the polished stone. He looked as though he had been struck by a physical blow. His face didn't just pale, it seemed to physically dissolve. The arrogant tilt of his chin vanished, replaced by a frantic, rhythmic twitching beneath his left eye. His skin took on the grayish hue of wet ash, sweat beading along a hairline that had always been held with such groomed precision. His mouth hung open, a hollow, silent O that made him look less like a titan of industry and more like a landed fish gasping for air. The veins in his neck pulsed with a visible, erratic thrum, and his eyes, once sharp with malice, were now wide, glassy, and darting toward every exit like a trapped animal, realizing the cage was electrified. "Elena," he screamed, the sound echoing off the high ceiling. "You can't do this. That projection was a lie. It's a forgery." She didn't turn around immediately. She let the silence of the foyer swallow his desperation. When she finally faced him, she saw her mother, Beatrice Vance, hovering in the doorway behind him. The older woman's face was a mask of frozen horror, her hand clutching a string of pearls so tightly the wire looked ready to snap. "Forgery?" Elena asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Simon Thorne is currently handing the original, notarized deeds to the board members, Julian, along with the forensic audit of the accounts you thought were hidden." Julian lunged toward her, his fingers clawing at the air as if he could snatch the truth back into the shadows. He stopped abruptly when Simon stepped from the shadows of the corridor, two uniformed security guards flanking him. The legal mind looked as immovable as a mountain, his expression devoid of the pity Julian was clearly fishing for. "Stay back, Mr. Vance," Simon said, his voice a low, professional rumble. "You are currently on private property without the owner's consent." Private property. Beatrice found her voice, though it was thin and shrill, stripped of its usual aristocratic polish. "This is our home. Elena, stop this nonsense at once. Think of the family name, think of the scandal." "I am thinking of the family, Mother," she replied, looking directly into the woman's cold, blue eyes. "I'm thinking of the grandfather who built this legacy, only to have his grandson treat it like a personal piggy bank while you look the other way. The scandal isn't what I did tonight. The scandal is the 5 years of theft you both thought I was too weak to notice." Uncle Arthur emerged from the ballroom, his face a study in grim satisfaction. He didn't look at Julian. He walked straight to Elena's side. Across the foyer, Clara Vance and several other board members watched from the doorway, their faces hardened into masks of corporate judgment. They weren't just witnesses. They were the jury, and their verdict was already written in the way they pulled their coats tighter, physically distancing themselves from the stench of Julian's failure. "The police are on their way, Julian," Arthur said quietly. "The board has already voted to freeze your access to all company assets. You have nothing left to manage." Julian's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of a mahogany console table to keep from falling, his knuckles turning white. The smell of expensive gin and nervous sweat wafted off him. "You're destroying me," he whispered, the entitlement finally curdling into raw, pathetic fear. "I'm your brother." "You were my brother when you signed those fraudulent transfers, too," she said. She stepped closer, the sharp click of her heels sounding like a gavel. "But you chose to be a thief instead. You told me I was a guest here. You were right. I'm not a guest anymore." She reached into her small clutch and pulled out a single, heavy brass key. She didn't hand it to him. She dropped it on the marble floor at his feet. The metallic ring was the loudest sound in the room. "That's the key to the service gate," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "It's the only one you'll be using from now on. Security will escort you and Mother to the guest house to collect your personal effects. You have 1 hour before the locks on the main house are changed." Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "The guest house? Elena, you can't be serious. In front of all these people. The people you spent your life trying to impress." Elena glanced at the board members, who were already turning back into the ballroom to discuss the transition of power. They aren't looking at you anymore, Mother. They're looking at the new majority shareholder. She turned her back on them both, her heart hammering a steady, triumphant rhythm against her ribs. As she walked toward the grand staircase, she felt the weight of years of gaslighting and belittlement falling away like dead skin. "Simon," she called out without looking back. "Yes, Miss Vance. Make sure they don't take the silver. It doesn't belong to them." She began to climb the stairs, her shadow stretching long and powerful across the foyer. Behind her, the sound of Julian's sobbing began, a high, thin wail of a man who had finally realized that the world he had stolen was no longer his to keep. Elena didn't flinch. She kept climbing, her eyes fixed on the darkness of the upper hallway, waiting for the morning when she could finally begin to rebuild. 6 months had passed since the night the Vance foyer echoed with Julian's cries and the shattering of a legacy built on lies. Elena Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new architectural firm, watching the sunset bleed crimson and gold over the city skyline. The air in her office smelled of fresh ink, expensive vellum, and the faint, grounding scent of cedarwood. It was a clean smell, a new smell. A soft knock at the door preceded Simon Thorne. He looked as sharp as ever, though the usual predatory edge in his eyes had softened into something resembling genuine respect. He placed a slim leather folder on her mahogany desk, the finality of a half-year's labor. "It's done, Elena," he said, his voice low. "The last of the offshore accounts have been liquidated. The Vance estate is officially restructured. You are the sole conservator of the remaining trust." She didn't turn around immediately. She felt the cool glass of the window against her forehead, a stark contrast to the heat of the brewing city below. "And the penthouse? Sold. The new owners took possession this morning," Simon replied. "Your mother moved into the apartment in the suburbs yesterday. Julian is currently residing in a studio near the docks. He started his court-mandated community service on Tuesday." Elena finally turned, her movements fluid and certain. She was no longer the woman who wore muted colors to blend into the wallpaper of her own life. Today, she wore a structured blazer of deep charcoal, her hair pulled back into a sleek, uncompromising knot. She looked every bit the majority shareholder the world now knew her to be. "I have a meeting with Beatrice in 20 minutes, she said, checking her watch. It was a simple, elegant piece, not the gaudy, diamond-encrusted monstrosity her mother had once insisted she wear. "She's waiting in the lobby." "Do you want me to stay?" Simon asked. "No, this is something I need to finish alone." When Elena descended to the lobby, the atmosphere shifted. The receptionist, a young woman who looked at Elena with a mixture of awe and professional terror, gestured toward the waiting area. There, sitting on a minimalist bench that looked far too modern for her, was Beatrice Vance. The transformation was jarring. Beatrice's face had aged a decade in half a year. The sharp, predatory line of her jaw had softened into something brittle and sagging, the skin beneath her eyes thin and translucent like parchment. Her eyes, once bright with the fire of social ambition, were now clouded with a permanent, simmering resentment that made her look small. She wore a coat from 3 seasons ago, the collar slightly frayed at the edges, and she clutched her faux leather handbag as if it were the last piece of a sinking ship. The expensive perfume that used to announce her arrival had been replaced by the sharp, medicinal scent of cheap hairspray. As Elena approached, Beatrice stood, her movements stiff. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't even offer a smile. "You look well," Beatrice said, though the words sounded like a curse. "I suppose life is easy when you've stripped your own blood of everything they worked for." "I took back what was stolen, Mother," Elena said, her voice like a calm sea. "There is a difference." Beatrice's lip curled, a flash of the old wolf appearing in her eyes. "Julian is living in a hovel. He has to take the bus, Elena. The bus. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is for a Vance to be seen on public transit? He needs a fresh start. A small loan, just enough to get him into a proper neighborhood where he can network." The audacity of the request sent a familiar spark of heat through Elena's chest, the first rage spike of the afternoon. Even now, After the fraud was exposed and the money was gone, the entitlement remained. "Julian needs a job, not a neighborhood," Elena replied. "He's lucky I didn't press charges for the embezzlement. The allowance you receive from the trust is more than enough for a comfortable life, provided you stop trying to buy the company of people who stopped calling you months ago." "You're ungrateful," Beatrice hissed, her voice rising just enough to make a passing courier glance their way. "After everything I sacrificed to keep this family's name in the social registers, you treat us like lepers." "You're a cold, heartless girl. You always were." Elena looked at her mother, really looked at her, and realized the secret power she now held wasn't just the money or the title. It was the fact that Beatrice's words no longer had the power to sting. The gaslighting had lost its fuel. "I'm the only reason you aren't in a shelter," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "Remember that the next time you decide to lecture me on family values." Beatrice flinched as if she'd been physically struck. She looked around the lobby, her eyes darting to the witnesses, the receptionist, the courier, the security guard. For the first time in her life, she saw that they weren't looking at her with envy. They were looking at her with pity. Elena pulled a small, white envelope from her blazer pocket and handed it over. "This is the deed to the suburban apartment. It's in your name, but there's a lien on it. You can't sell it, and you can't leverage it. You have a roof over your head for the rest of your life, Beatrice. That is my final gift to you." Beatrice snatched the envelope, her knuckles white. She opened her mouth to deliver one last venomous remark, but Elena had already turned her back. As Elena walked toward the elevators, she felt the victory. It was heavy and solid, but as she reached her office and looked at the empty chair across from her desk, she also felt the cost. She had won the war, saved the legacy, and secured her future. But the family she had spent 30 years trying to earn the love of was gone, replaced by a bitter woman in a frayed coat and a brother who didn't know how to be a man without a silver spoon. She sat down, the silence of the room absolute. She had built a kingdom, but she was the only one left to inhabit it. Elena picked up her pen and began to work, her shadow stretching long and solitary across the pristine floor. Justice had been served, but the taste was as cold and sharp as the winter air outside.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.